is I will call each of the artists up one at a time. I'll give you their bio. They will tell you for about 5 minutes they've picked one T.C. Cannon work that's in the exhibition that means something to them, that resonates for them, and they'll talk about it in conjunction with one artwork that they've created. So we'll do that for each of the 4 artists, and then we're going to have a little Q&A. So that's the plan, and I'm going to start with Meredith, who is of the Cherokee Nation, and Meredith is the publishing editor of First American Art Magazine. She is an author, artist, and independent curator whose curatorial practice spans over 2 decades. She earned her MFA degree from San Francisco Art Institute, where T.C. Cannon went for a semester, by the way, and has taught art history at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Santa Fe Community College, and the Cherokee Humanities course. Meredith serves on the board of the Wheelwright Museum and the Cherokee Arts and Humanities Council. So please welcome America.
Thank you all for staying here. We're going to wake you up. And thank you, Karen, for having us, and thank you for the Wampanoag for letting us hang out on your land and have this stuck. I don't know why I'm looking at that. I can critique it. So it's funny, in Oklahoma, like, everyone loves TC, and we always enjoyed the fact that the 2 most famous Santa Fe artists are from Oklahoma, Alan Hauser and TC Cannon. So I'm really grateful that Karen took a risk and let me write some of the object entries for the catalog, which was really exciting, and I appreciate it. So I got to closely revisit TC's work and really look at it and just be thoroughly impressed anew. And I really, I was inspired by this one, the Pueblo woman dancer, which I'd never noticed before. This is going to drive me insane. And looking at it, you know, he has these very fierce elderly women that tend to be very tough, and he does obscure the face. I appreciated what he was doing there, and I'm kind of jealous of him that he was at this cusp between modernism and postmodernism. And looking at how he uses the materials, he still was very much in modernism, where he could let the materials speak for themselves. And this painting is very much about a painting. He's completely defining the picture plane. He's really concerned about color theory. He's really concerned about strokes, you know, and different scumbling techniques. And this is one of his... They don't know when this was, but you can tell this is an incredibly mature artist. It's very stripped down. He doesn't need to do a lot. He doesn't need to embellish because he has such a confident hand. So even though there actually looks like there's more details than there are, it's an illusion. And I love the fact that if you compare this to this flat style southwestern painting that we're used to, that when it's a Pueblo painting, which we have a Pueblo painter right here, so he can talk more about that, there's a great deal of information conveyed about the dancers. The regalia is correct. You know exactly what dance they're doing. All the information is very lucid and very well lit. T.C. Cannon is Kiowa. He was enrolled Kiowa, and he's of Caddo descent. He's an outsider. So I think that's very interesting that he's portraying this not as an ethnographer, not as a member of this community, but as an outsider. So a lot of this is obscured. You can't see her jewelry. You can't see the information. You know, there's embroidery. We know it's that negative embroidery. And I just love the fact that he's working from this burnt sienna ground and then painting over it. And it's the same thing that's echoing the technique of the negative embroidery in the woman's manta, where the base is the color and then the design is picked out of that base. So I love how he's echoing that. But there's not ethnographic information. This is not shedding a light. This woman's culture is not available to us. I know very little. I lived in Santa Fe for 8 years. I know very little about Pueblo religion because I don't ask questions because it's none of my business, basically. And that's what I see in this painting. Just this respect, because Pueblo people have been able to, as a strategy, they've kind of gone underground with a lot of their religious information. And there's kind of a need to know basis when it comes to indigenous knowledge, where if you don't need to know it, you don't need to know it. So you don't ask questions, you kind of wait for what's shared. So I just think that is, I mean, this is incredibly respectful. I think it's putting up a barrier, and I think it's appropriate because, you know, we're all navigating, well, not all of us, that's silly to say, but in navigating an intertribal environment, how do you follow proper protocols and properly reflect people of other tribes? So actually this worked out quite lovely. So this really kind of reminded me of my own piece, which is this series is called The Greater Vehicle, which is, you know, kind of based on, I got this information from my brother, but this notion that in Buddhism that you can be all holy and live in a monastery and pray all the time, but the greater vehicle is to actually be spiritual out in the world. So this whole series, this was when I was at San Francisco Art Institute, and I completely understand why T.C. Cannon dropped out very rapidly and enlisted in Vietnam. That says a lot about the school. But, you know, I had, at this point in my painting career, I had a hard time developing, and I'm running out of time, sorry, developing series. So I made rules. So I had to follow this color pattern. So we're both using this, you know, primary, these reds, these yellows and blues, but we both shifted them. They aren't just, you know, the basic primaries that you would expect. So this stems out of something I did previously about Loyal, Oklahoma, which is a German-American community on Cheyenne Arapaho lands. And I always made fun of Cherokees that paint about Plains Indians, and then lo and behold, I transformed myself into one. But temporarily for this. But it's God gives the world to Arapaho children, so that is and kin is Arapaho. So that's an Arapaho symbol for God, and then, you know, here's this, you know, we're both borrowing heavily on just layers of art history because that's allowable in the postmodern world, is that we can mine the past as source material. So this is an Arapaho song, and here is a photograph of a historical Arapaho child, and of course he's inheriting the world, and he's kind of, thanks a lot, guys, for the condition that we're handing it in. Then it says no cross. So this is very much about the center of the world. Sorry, I really need to wrap it up. And of course, TC's conveying the Sundance, which has an axis mundi. And I think this idea of the center of the world, everywhere you go, if you're a Native person, you understand the concept of the center world. I think William S. Yellowrope was talking on that very beautifully. And the fact of how do we respect people from other cultures, even as a tribal person. So I've heard a lot about marginalization and how do we get TC in the center. TC is in the center. Okay. That's my 5 minutes.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So our next artist is Hoka Skenandore, who is Oneida, Oglala Lakota, Luiseño, and Chicano. Hoka works as a painter, printmaker, muralist, and graffiti artist whose work juxtaposes imagery and text to explore the unsettling of the West, indigenous survivance, and stereotyping with wit and humor. After a year in AmeriCorps, he attended the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and earned a BFA in 2006. He has shown throughout the United States and Canada, including at the Musée, this is not good, I'm not good with French, Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montreal, the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery in Toronto, Exhibit C Gallery in Oklahoma City, and Racing Magpie in Rapid City, South Dakota. Hoka is currently an MFA candidate at the University of Oklahoma. So thrilled you're here.
Trying to keep the timer going, so don't worry, I'm not keeping a secondary conversation. Sagoli, my name is Yate Holiwa, which translates to he has many different interests. I want to thank the Wampanoag people and the other ancestral caretakers of this land for giving us this space and for having this time. I want to thank Karen, I want to thank Rachel, and my fellow panelists. With this particular piece, I have to kind of backtrack a little bit with some history. I went to the Institute of American Indian Arts. I started in 2001. Prior to that, the Institute had pulled things out of their permanent collection to showcase work from the 60s. I believe the show was actually called IAIA Rocks the 60s. And so within this plethora of really intriguing pieces that these students were making at this really pivotal time in the history of the school were a couple of T.C. Cannon selections, but it was this piece in particular that had really caught my attention. I turned a corner and I see this figure standing to me near a wall that had text on it. And so instantaneously my mind, goes to graffiti. And so graffiti was my first art that I ever fell in love with and kind of dedicated way too many hours to. And so to see this piece with this singular figure standing by this wall with these letters, it was very intriguing to me. And if you're familiar with T.C. Cannon's work, his native portrayals are really the most iconic things that he's done. So to have this, it was kind of like a little bit of an odd man out. And I stood with this piece and was really intrigued by it. And this concept kind of hit me right at that moment as I was about to enter into my undergraduate studies. And looking at this piece, I thought to myself, here's like probably one of the most famous native artists making something that doesn't look particularly native. And so this became a particular game plan for me during my studies. I realized that he was able to open up this world, even if it was just for one piece, where you do not have to specifically portray things, and even beyond love. And I mean, there's text in here that probably refers back to, and definitely with the title, Bob Dylan lyrics. He was a big fan of Bob Dylan. And I find Bob Dylan intriguing just in a music history sense, how much his influence was placed upon other kinds of music. Other bands had huge hits with the poetry that he was writing. And so it's fascinating to me that that influence actually kind of ties into some of the work that TC did too. With the kind of work that TC was doing, I think in general, most students of the Institute of American Indian Arts can say that his influence is huge, and you cannot ignore all of the vast work that he created. But I think he also opened up that opportunity to play with and investigate different modes of looking at, especially when he was referring back to those historical photographs. One of the things that I've done that's definitely something that was presented from him is taking historical photographs by people like Edward S. Curtis and then contextualizing them in a contemporary way. And so I'm a huge Star Wars fan. And so to have that kind of imagery interplayed with, you know, something that's kind of the past creates these interesting dynamics and allows us to have a conversation that's more contemporary, to kind of confront those stereotypes. And to me, there's that thread that connects back to TC's work, where maybe it's not an obvious presentation of those kind of ideas about indigeneity or the interplay with indigenous concepts in painting, but you can still make really great contemporary art, and it doesn't have to reflect too obvious of a face in that regard. And I'm very, very, very pleased to see that this is one of the first pieces you see when you enter the show. So this was a pivotal piece for me early on, and I can still look back to the body of work that this man created, and it's a huge inspiration, and I'm sure it is for the rest of the panel. That's not quite 5 minutes, but that's it for me.
That's great. Okay, our next artist is Jason Garcia, who is from the Santa Clara, Pueblo, Tewa. He is Santa Clara, Pueblo, Tewa. In Jason Garcia's work, most often clay tiles that are created in the traditional Pueblo way with hand-gathered clay, native clay slips, and outdoor firings, he transforms materials closely connected to the earth into a visually rich mix of Pueblo history and culture, comic book superheroes, video game characters, religious icons, and all things pop culture. Garcia has received numerous awards, including a Ronald N. and Susan Dubin Fellowship at the School for Advanced Research, and both the Best of Classification and Artist Choice Awards at the Santa Fe Indian Market. His work is also in the collections of the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, and the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. He received his BFA from the University of New Mexico and MFA in printmaking at the University of Wisconsin. So let's welcome Jason to the podium. Hey.
Let me also start my timer. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Peabody Essex. Thank you to the ancestral people here of what is currently known as Salem, Massachusetts. But I noticed as the slides came up, I actually chose this. I originally chose Pueblo Woman Dancer, the Buffalo Dancer. America got it before I did, so I said, okay, I'll do Cloud Madonna. So Cloud Madonna's actually, oh, is it on the next one? I don't know if you... Okay, yeah, cool. So, okay. So in terms of my work, I'm using traditional materials and techniques I come from a Pueblo that's very known, worldwide known, internationally known for its pottery traditions. So, you know, I've grown up in a pottery tradition family and all. And I'm the odd man out in terms of the artists here. Everybody's an alum of Institute of American Indian Art, and I did not go to school at the Institute of American Indian Art. But I was familiar with T.C. Cannon's work growing up of my parents going to different gallery shows, museum shows, and you know, you're kind of immersed into this creative environment, so you're kind of aware of what's around. And then, of course, undergrad years, that He Who Stands in the Sun book came out. So, you know, you're flipping through it, but, you know, there's these little images, 2 by 2 inches, and that you see the original painting. It's just like mind-blowing. And the exhibition upstairs is amazing. And yeah, it's just phenomenal. And then to be able to stand in front of the painting, you know, inches, and if you were any closer, you'd be in the painting. So that's kind of, it's amazing. So as far as like looking at what I have here, you know, I can look at the textiles. So I was familiar with the Cloud Madonna, and I knew that TC had used Santa Clara Pueblo woman. Her name is Laurencita Tafoya. I'm not too sure who the photographer is on that one. And Karen showed 3 images, I believe, this morning of that particular lady. You know, he reversed the painting, has her holding the squash. In the original, the squash is on the roof, and she's where it has like the typical, quote-unquote, traditional Pueblo black pottery with the vase. And as far as my work, you know, looking at the patterns, the textiles, you know, that textile that's on the shawl is like this really amazing fluorescent green, and just the patterning is amazing. And so I use a lot of patterning also in my work. And as Hoka said earlier, of being a huge Star Wars fan, you know, I'm a pretty large, big Star Wars fan as well too. So, you know, on the textiles is on her shirt is C-3PO, and then on her cape is R2-D2. So, you know, again, reflecting, you know, different storytelling. And, you know, we have our own stories, ancestral stories, creation stories, migration stories. And, you know, Star Wars is essentially a migration story of how Luke, you know, the hero story. So, you know, Luke going from Tatooine and becoming this Jedi who wasn't that great in The Last Jedi, but, you know, he's a Jedi nonetheless. But, you know, we all have different interpretations of stories and things like that. Also, one of the things that I always liked about TC's work was, you know, his use of clouds. You know, there's this little, you know, there's 3 clouds in there, but in his paintings, you'll see one cloud just kind of laying there in the sky. And, you know, New Mexico is like that. And, you know, I use the ancestral icon of the rain cloud in the majority of all my work. It's almost become signature in a sense, where people ask, oh, did you create this? And I didn't create it, my ancestors created it. But just carrying on that iconography, it's the tie to the ancestral past and also into our future as well too. And then there's also the symbolism of color symbolism as well too, in terms of each of the 6 colors represent 6 cardinal directions as well. And I see it went off. I don't know if it's and so without the images. So, and then also, you know, there on the corner, there's like the abstracted silhouette of the Pueblo in the back, and so I use that a lot in my work as well too. And symbols of technology and television. My Pueblo, St. Clair of Assisi, our patron saint, is celebrated on August 12th, and she's the patron saint of the blind, embroiderers, and also television. So I always use that television antenna as kind of that symbol, that place marker of the place where I'm from, but then also its effect on our traditions, our songs, our culture. You know, it's kind of binary. It's kind of either good, bad, it's kind of in the middle. So I know I'm over, so I'll move on next. Got to keep it.
It's okay because you're holding us together.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's true. And Yeah, so again, just I looked at the Pueblo Buffalo Dancer, and when I look at it, I for myself as a fan of TC Cannon, I feel it's unfinished. Just that white, the background, her white dress, like the embroidery designs and things like that. It's just doesn't. It seemed like it's not finished. Just and we were looking at it last night and talking about it, and I don't think I think it's unfinished personally, but it's still an amazing painting nonetheless. And so you can kind of see how the abstracted Pueblo background is also there with a kiva ladder. And this one isn't the best abstracted background for my piece, but if you look the other work, you'll see that I do use the two-story with the ladders and kiva ladders and television antennas as well too. So now that we're back, I'll turn it over to Ken. Thanks. Thank you.
Looks like we're back in action with the screen. Our next artist, Ken Williams Jr. He is Northern Arapaho, Seneca. Ken began his career at an early age, experimenting as a self-taught artist who learned by observing friends and family. He completed his BA in Museum Studies at the Institute of American Indian Arts in 2007, and while there, he took beadwork classes from noted bead artist Terry Greaves. Since 2003, he has been participating in the Southwest Association for Indian Arts, SWAIA, annual Indian Market in Santa Fe, and since 2006 at the Heard Museum annual Indian Market and Festival in Phoenix. Williams' work has been widely exhibited and has garnered many awards. It is in many prominent collections, including the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Arts, the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian, the Heard Museum, the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, the Montclair Art Museum, National Museum of Scotland, as well as many private collections nationwide. And I will also add that you were in Native Fashion Now. He was an artist in Native Fashion Now that many in our audience are probably familiar with. So why don't you come on up? Thank you.
Let me get my stopwatch here. First, I guess I didn't get the note to wear dark colors. I'm like, the brightest one here. Hang on, let me get this set so I don't go over. Okay. Niawai Skenandore Gagwego, Ken Williams Nikyaso, Onondawaga I am, or I am born for, and Blue Sky people I am. So I'm from the Arapaho people of Wyoming, and Onondawaga from Cattaraugus, New York, people of the hills or the Seneca people. Thanks to Karen and Rachel and Pam for asking us to come here. This is great, and 4 really great friends, 5 really great friends. And I also want to acknowledge Mr. David Schultz, who came from Kennebunkport, Maine. He's got a gallery, home and away gallery, and he's represented my work before too, as well as lots of choice pieces. Okay, so the piece I chose was Favorite Wife, and it kind of goes a little more like in depth that it was like a puzzle for me, because I also am, I work with Joyce Cannon, his sister, to resell his artwork from the estate. So it's a little more connection for me, and this is in my day job at the Case Trading Post at the Wheelwright Museum. So seeing a lot of these pieces in the exhibit was like, wow, going through her files and her records, finding pieces that originally had sketches to the original paintings was like very like, oh my gosh, this is what he portrayed through a small sketch, and I'm touching the original sketch. And I'm selling the original sketch to clients and trying to tell them how important that sketch is. So kind of first going over that, I found the sketch for Favorite Mahi, or Favorite Wife, which is upstairs next to the original image. I think there's something kind of, when we look at this, what do we see? Obviously, it's a man and a woman, hugging and showing their love and respect for each other. Favorite wife, what is that? Amongst our Plains people, multiple wives was not uncommon. Quanah Parker had 8 wives, and he did have his favorite wives, Tonarsi and Tope. So maybe this is, do we look at this as Southern Plains or Northern Plains Indian culture? Was this the favorite wife? Did he have more than one wife? I think it's for us to think and figure. But I think the connection for me was more deep because I actually got to see and hold the sketch before it made it to the exhibition, which you can see upstairs. Kind of tying my work into it. I'm sorry for the image, it wasn't that crisp. But this actually is housed in the Montclair Art Museum in New Jersey. They commissioned me to do a piece when they reinstalled their Native American wing. They wanted a permanent piece to install. So they basically said, do what you want. And I think I was making this piece around the time I was doing a sales exhibition at the Wheelwright for TC, but it wasn't really in my mind. So, I was studying a lot of Warhol. TC's always been like this iconic person to us, especially going to IAIA. He's always considered, the wow factor of our school. So I was doing this piece, and I thought, I'm going to try something different. I like to use color. I'm not afraid of color. So that's just my personality and background. So in my work, you'll see different colors, different shades, swirls, just kind of dreamlike figures. So with this piece I did here, it's a Shoshone couple, and we come from, on my mom's tribe, the Intermontane Great Basin Plains area. And a lot of the people dress similar, with beautiful clothing, calicos that came from trade, beadwork. And this one I wanted to make really wild. And you can see she has purple hair, or pink hair, he has purple hair. My way of pictorial is including three-dimensional work, like the little pipe bag. His otter breastplate is actually made out of otter. The hair was actually human hair that's been dyed, kind of these punk rocker type colors. So you can see that, and I think that's what always influences me with TC's work is the color. It's like, let me, get to know my subject. I'm going to eat cotton candy, and then you might see a cotton candy background or something. And I think that reminds me of stuff as I was a kid. So I think these kind of tied together, and I think that's why I chose that as well. But again, it was like the deeper meaning for me because I'm also a collector of Indian art, and it's like, oh my gosh, wow, this is like the wow factor to find the little sketch that we see in the painting.
The microphone will work, I don't know. Maybe it won't. But, I don't have the same kind of voice as William. I can't yell like that. Or not yell, but speak with loudness. Okay, so my first question is for America. Your paintings mix historical and contemporary elements, as well as fictional and non-fictional characters to tell your stories. How has Canon, who produced similar mashups of past and present in his paintings, influenced your choices and devices?
How has he influenced me? I think anyway. I think it's just a drive. I don't know. I mean, I don't think you guys consider yourselves historians, but I mean, you guys convey history in your art too. And I think there's just such a strong desire in the Native art world to convey who we are, what we've been through, to cut through all the misinformation that we just fall on it, that you just are driven to do that. And I heard from Bill War Soldier Sosa, who unfortunately has passed, that when TC and him ordered a lot of these historical images, they weren't actually that common. Now there's like, entire Facebook groups that are like all of this. So now that stuff's so ubiquitous. But one thing TC did that was really beautiful is completely make it his own. But I think, again, that's, I would argue, I don't know, that TC was absolutely on the cusp of the turn from modernism to postmodernism. And my understanding is modernism was a global wave in art and thinking. And what was othered, it was no longer like, oh, those people over there are the other. What was othered was the past. So this ushering in of postmodernism was now we can mine the past again. And I think in the Native art world, a lot of concerns override anything going on in the outside art world, which we just want to send messages about who we are and what we've been through and what we're going to do too. That it's just this incredible urge to convey that information. And a lot of times people don't have the patience to open a book. It's too hard. Everything on TV about Native stuff is garbage. So painting is one vehicle. The fine arts have been a vehicle historically that Native people can use to reach other audiences.
Thank you. The next question is for Hoka. Your work has a process and aesthetic that I think nods to Robert Rauschenberg, a clear influence of Canon as well. Canon looked to Native and non-Native artists for inspiration. And the question is, what other artistic influences do you think you share with Canon? And maybe you don't feel like you look to Robert Rauschenberg, but what artistic influences do you think you do share with him?
Hello. I would say the Rauschenberg thing's pretty legitimate. I mean, both in his work and mine. I'm a huge student of pop art, love the Warhol. I think more particularly when I think of T.C. Cannon, though, I think one thing that was really relevant was his relationship to Fritz Scholder, and I'm sure people have their opinions about who was stealing from who, but I was elucidated to this point that there's a student-teacher relationship there, and I didn't learn that until I had actually studied under Norman Akers. And so having worked with him, I would ask him, like, hey, did you take this element from somebody else? He'd be like, yeah, I did. Or, I would kind of complain, oh, maybe some of the things I'm doing are too much like what you do as far as a technique or a particular way of rendering an image. And he said, that's just part of what happens. You get into this particular groove with a student and you feed off of each other. So that helped to kind of illuminate possibly, for me, that relationship that he had with Fritz, and kind of had shown a side of that where I'd mostly heard, somebody was stealing from somebody. Generally it's Fritz was stealing from TC, but I think the dynamic was a little more in depth there, and that opened up some of that subtlety to me in a way. So.
Yeah, the couple people that I talked to who were teachers and instructors and involved in the IAA back in the 60s kind of framed it like it was this electric think tank where everybody was sort of, that it's not really productive to always say that Fritz was taking from TC or other students were taking from Fritz, that there was like a feedback effect. And I think you can see some of that riffing certainly, and or appropriation in some of Fritz's work based on TC's work, but nevertheless, yes. Okay, so Jason, you have an MFA in printmaking, and Cannon was a painter who also made some prints over his career, at least 15 of them. How has printmaking influenced your practice, and can you draw any parallels to Cannon's evolution as an artist?
Parallels to myself and him. We're both Native. We hang out in San Jose. That's about it. I don't know. I mean, you think of this guy as being like the, Native contemporary artist of the 21st century, so that's probably about the only parallels I can Yeah, you're kind of putting me in like this huge category. I mean, like he's like Yoda, and I'm like, the kid that got killed, the Padawan type thing.
Okay.
So that's kind of how I see the parallel. As a printmaker, so my practice has been based in the quote-unquote, again, traditional practice of pottery. And, my work is very influenced by graphic novels, comic books, movies, pop culture, things like that. And did some printmaking in undergrad, but then, later had an opportunity to do a residency at Arizona State University, where then that kind of put the seed to say, okay, well, let's try printmaking. But also, the work that I was already doing, it was already like this cycle of some of the things I was doing was basically printmaking, but on ceramics in a sense, or different methods that I was using already. So the transition from being like this potter, ceramic artist to printmaking is back and forth. So I feel that, TC, being a painter and doing printmaking is like this fluid motion of creating. It's back and forth. It's not, there's nothing that's really separate in terms of creating the work. So that's how I kind of see myself. My practice is coming from my, again, traditional background of Pueblo pottery, it's a family business. Printmaking is something that I learned in grad school in that sense. So it's like two separate practices and two separate types of training in that sense. And as a printmaker, I see TC, we were talking about this earlier, of saying that, and just listening to Rachel's talk also, Tamarind 70s, it's a very secretive process, lithography. And sometimes master printers do not want to share their techniques. So we were saying, well, did TC actually cut the wood blocks? Probably not. He had the Japanese master printers do it for him. He had the sketch, gave it to them, they worked from it. Same thing with Anadarko Princess. He did the line, someone did the touche. So there was the collaboration between printer and the artist. So that's myself, I'm doing all the printing, I'm doing everything. So there's no in-between person. So in that sense, there's that difference, I guess.
That's great. You answered the question, which I appreciate. Thank you. Ken, as a collector of Canon's work and as an artist yourself, it appears that the figures in your beadwork adopt the same powerful presence as Canon's figures. And you talked a little bit about this, but if you could share a little bit more, what aspect of Canon's figures inspire your own?
I think, not limitation. Terry Graves was the one that kind of really broke me out of my shell. She's a Kiowa beadworker, and she taught me that my work should kind of tell a story or something that's happening in my life. So, at this point, like I said, I was really researching him at the time, and the colors were really bright, really vivid. With TC's work, I think, the cotton candy-looking clouds or wild colors of men with purple hair and things like that were inspirational to me at that time. And, still are. And seeing all of these major pieces in person, like Jason touched upon earlier, you see the books and you look at these books over and over and it's like, oh my gosh, to see them in person, it's like, whoa. And then to eventually myself be able to own, sketches or stuff by TC in my own personal collection, it's like, whoa, this is like something like this master guy did. And that's not easily available on the market. And it's kind of like the work finds me, and many of my other Indian artist friends say, can you collect things, you like things, and they kind of find you for the reason because you're the next caretaker. So I think, back to the question, it's like the colors, the brightness, the palettes, to me and him, they kind of connect with each other.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I do want to ask America this one question, and then we'll see. We'll probably wrap it up. So, Cannon said, "I am tired of Bambi-like deer paintings reproduced over and over, and I am tired of cartoon paintings of my people that grace mansions at a going rate of nothing and the same going rate for the artist," in response to the Dorothy Dunn studio style. America, as an artist and art historian, could you address some of the complexities of this art history and why you think Cannon responded the way he did, and how you've addressed some of this art history in your own work?
I think he said this when he was pretty young, and when you're at IAI, Sati taught there, Bill taught there, but it's kind of when everyone's in their super militant stage. So I think if he had lived longer, he would be much more mellow about like destroying Bambi. But I don't know if you've seen the Sherman Chattleston piece where they actually pictured him. But the story goes that Pop Shali painted the blue deer regularly, and Walt Disney in the 30s visited her studio. He bought several of her pieces, and then later Bambi was produced. So sometimes the story gets mixed, like, oh yeah, these Native people are imitating Bambi. It's like, no, it's the other way around. But the blue deer is an incredibly important figure in Huichol religion, and there's references to peyote and Native American church, so that was really important in the Southern Plains. Quanah Parker was a major leader in the Native American church. And all those early artists, especially in Oklahoma, like A.C. Blue Eagle, when they're painting the blue deer, they're talking about Native American church and their involvement in it, so it's incredibly spiritual coming from Mexico. But I think, that just cut out? No. It's interesting, the pieces you showed that juxtapose what TC's doing in the 1960s with the start of IAI, you're showing work from the 30s, so, and the 20s. The Kiowa 6 were active in 1928, 29. And it's interesting that TC's calling it the Dorothy Dunn School. Dorothy Dunn only taught there for 5 years. It was Geronimo Montoya Cruz that taught there for like most of the centuries, segueing up to the development of IAs. I mean, so it's really interesting that her name doesn't get minted with the school. So I think there's been some kind of recuperation about, kind of the chain of events of flat style and how Dorothy Dunn only had a small influence on much larger movement of flat style. But at that time, it just had really become reified. There had been generations and generations after the 30s, and it had gotten to the point where Bob Houseless puts this so beautifully, walking in pretty. The Navajo chant, I'm walking in beauty. And there's a lot of safe, pin it down, we want Native art to follow rules and not threaten us. A lot of rich Texans come and spend their money, don't make the rich Texans mad or question it. So there really was a much needed explosion at IAI that happened.
Thank you. I'm going to just do a quick time check. I'm looking to Rachel. Help. We have time for another question? Okay. Well, the next question, we're going to have to do one more for each of the three because that's only fair. So my next question for Hoka was, Cannon was an aspiring musician, and Hoka, your work references music in a strong way. You have a series painted on vinyl records, one of which we got to see. And could you speak about the role music has in your practice, and more specifically, the vinyl series?
Sure. The vinyl record series is just partially an outgrowth of owning vinyl records and then having stuff that's too beat up to play. But the inspiration for actually constructing these images came from two sources. It was a graffiti artist from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then having seen Gerhard Richter doing a series on vinyl of abstractions, and so I thought, I could play with this idea, combine the two, and I also was looking at that as sources, but I also take song titles and use those too to kind of create weird, loose narratives and have an interplay between that and the imagery. It's clear that T.C. Cannon was a huge, huge music fan, loved the Bob Dylan, and I mean, it's not everybody's technique necessarily to put on music while you're working, but it can be a helpful and kind of inspirational thing. So I could definitely see him, dropping the needle on some Dylan. Ironically enough, at the IAI library, there were some records in there that were old, and one of them happened to migrate out of that particular section, and it was a Bob Dylan album that is now in my collection. So I just like that there's that potential that maybe it was TC's, I don't know. But anyway, yeah, they're going to ban me now. But music is important, though, yeah.
That will be my next commission for the Peabody Essex Museum on that record. Thank you. Okay, so Jason, Cannon's work often focuses on a single frame of a bigger story, kind of like a comic book cell or a single frame of a film strip that is sequential, connected to a series. And your work takes inspiration in part from comic books. Whether it's printmaking or ceramics, you seem to focus on the composition of an individual panel that is often connected to a larger story. In what ways do you bring together elements of comics to communicate your perspective as an artist?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, just in terms of the storytelling. So, like the Corn Maiden, in that I had on the slide there, she's holding her iPhone, and so that's the story also of being like, well, what's she listening to? She listening to Beyonce or Bob Dylan or Coltrane, or that's the other part of it, how music influences work too, and like Hoka, I listen to music while I produce in the studio as well too. So there's that part of it that tells a story in the work as well. Then comic strips, comic book stories. Again, sometimes I've been told like, oh wow, you're doing this really new, contemporary, groundbreaking work, and it's not anything that hasn't been told in the past in terms of kiva murals or paintings on teepees with stories, hunting stories, things like that. So it's just a continuation of our personal narratives, our cultural narratives, things like that. So it's not anything that we haven't been doing, or telling the hero story, Beowulf, for instance. These are old, ancient stories that we're retelling and reinterpreting, and maybe we change things, or it's even like your hunting story. You're saying like, oh yeah, man, that buck was, it gets bigger each time, or that fish gets bigger each time. So it's basically, in a sense, it's just this retelling of the story, and it grows, bigger, or sometimes it gets smaller too, as we even forget stories, or even using the imagery, the photographs, and saying like, well, who is this person, of in the work? And sometimes they're relatives, sometimes they're an unknown person, but they're part of our tribe still yet, but they're still carrying on that story through imagery, and through paintings, through stories, through songs, ritual, all of that. So.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, so the last question is for Ken, and it's kind of what we started talking about on the first art history panel, but do you have any thoughts on what steps that we can take to approach art history and criticism in a way that accelerates progress toward a more inclusive definition of American art, one that expands Native art into wider acceptance, opinion, and criticism? What steps do people need to take, whether it's a museum or galleries or an art community?
Wow, she had to give me like the hardest question. I think what you're doing.
It was a question for all of the panelists, but we only have time
but
for you.
she left it with me. How rude. No, I think exactly what you're doing now. I mean, you're showing T.C. Cannon as not just an Indian artist. He's an artist, first and foremost. And I think, that old saying kind of goes, yeah, I'm an artist, but I happen to be Indian. Not boxing people in for their culture or their, race or identity. And I think, what you've done with the show is you've brought him back to, he's always this important artist, but you made him even more. And I think it shows, with a well-renowned museum here, that he's being shown as an artist. And I think it's first and foremost an artist that happens to be Indian. So I think, we look at these things in more of a general terms or general way
to say, wow, this is cool. You know, he's actually being given the due that he needs to be given. So I think that's how we should or encourage people to look at things.